Good morning. It's a beautiful day in Scotland, and I'm here in my dining room. I'm just about to have breakfast, so I have my coffee and my cafetiere and a very continental breakfast this morning. So I hope you're all well, and I hope those of you who are in Scotland or around Scotland are also enjoying this unusually sunny weather. So this is part three of writing your first novel, and one thing I did want to say before we start on today's exercise is don't worry if you're not able to keep up. You don't have to do this, in real time. So you can always go back to these videos. They're not going to be taken down, certainly not by me. So it's absolutely fine, to do this in your own pace. I'll keep posting these on a daily basis. I'll probably take the weekends off and just go through the whole thing at your own time. So today's exercise. So I guess now that you've got or will eventually have a synopsis or an outline of what the story of your novel is, what I figured would be the next best thing is to decide on the word count. So how long do you want your novel to be? How big? So some of you will be aiming for the stars and will be writing a huge fantasy or historical epic. Others will be wanting to go for something, a bit more slimline. For beginner authors, I would certainly say the standard length for a novel is between 60 to 80,000 words. For the purposes of this exercise, though, what I would suggest is always try and write more rather than less. And the reason for that is if you write too much, it's easier when you get to the editorial process to actually pare that back and cut it down. It makes your life easier and the editors and the publishers, depending if you go down that avenue. And if you write too little, the problem with that is that sometimes you end up having to add additional material, and that can cause problems much later on because it requires more of a structural edit rather than a straightforward copy edit. So if you plan it a bit more at this stage, it can actually save you, if you're self-publishing, it could potentially save you money in the long run, because a structural edit will cost more, generally speaking, than a copy edit would. A structural edit would probably have to occur if your novel was too short, in other words. So if you're aiming, I would probably aim for between 80 to 90,000 words, just to get you started, and then we can always redress that further on. So once you've decided on your word count, and I always say aim higher, than you're capable of, always stretch yourself with these things a little bit if you can. I guess the next question you might have is, well, how long should each chapter be? It varies. So, for example, historical fiction, the chapters tend to be quite lengthy, and fantasy books as well, because there's such a lot of characters. Usually it's usually something that describes a whole world. There's a lot of detail in those books. With books that are present day, I think the tendency is that, writers assume that you know what's going on in the world today, so it needs a little bit less explanation, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of shortcuts in terms of narrative description in books that are set in the present day, crime thrillers, romance, whatever you will. However, as a general rule, I edited a novel just recently, and that every chapter was roughly 4 pages long, which worked absolutely fine. It depends on your style, your voice, which you will gradually discover for yourself as you write. So it's down to you. See what you feel comfortable with. Maybe write the first 2 or 3 chapters, review them, and then see what the length actually is on average, and then you could average that out, divide that by the 80 or 90,000 words, and then you've got a rough idea of how many chapters you will need to get to that target word count. And from then you can also go back to your one-page synopsis, and quite a clever thing to do at this stage is to divide the 3 sections. So divide all the chapters that you've now accumulated in your head and divide them by 3. So you would have, let's say it was 60 chapters, just to keep the example simple. So it would potentially be 20 chapters for section 1, then the middle part of the book would be 20 chapters, and 20 chapters as we get towards the end. Now that can be changed, there's all sorts of rules that can be broken, and that's absolutely fine. But it just gives you a basic structure. And I always think it's a good idea to have a basic structure rather than none at all. So see how you get on with that today. It's a fairly simple exercise. It's more arithmetic than anything else. And you can maybe just tentatively get started on your first chapter. One thing I will say about first chapters, just as a little hint, especially for historical fiction authors, a lot of first chapters or prologues tend to be cluttered full of characters, lists of characters, especially if those characters are based on actual persons that existed. And I think it's partly because of the author showing all the research they did, so wanting to list every single detail. So that's absolutely fine, there's nothing wrong with showing your prowess in terms of, how much research you've done, but is it important to the reader? Maybe not. For example, there might be a couple and they have 7 children, which wasn't unusual back in certain periods of time. So let's say they've 7 children. So do you need to name every single child in that first chapter? Probably not. You might not even need to name them at all if they don't become major players in your narrative. So just be aware of things like that, with your first chapter. Just set the tone and see how you get on. And bear in mind, you've got a whole novel to introduce characters. So it's not something you need to cram into that first chapter. The first chapter is something I'll maybe talk about tomorrow, actually, given that that's now in my head. So I have an idea. So I hope these videos are helpful for you. If you have any questions, you know where to get in touch with me, and my website is www.ianskews.com. And if you are further on in the process and you are looking for an editor or a proofreader, I am available at the same website. Right, I am going to have some coffee and try and wake up properly now. Goodbye, take care, and happy writing.